Hi everyone, my name's Theo, I'm the Telegraph's podcast editor, and I just wanted to warn you that in this episode of the Juggling Act there is a little bit of fruity language, so it's one you might not want to listen to in front of young children. On with the show.
I think the best word to describe motherhood, or a series of words, is full on. The idea of having to do my job at the same time as looking after a newborn baby kind of bursts every kind of brain cell I've got. Right. Hi, my name's Claire Newell and I'm the investigations editor at the Telegraph. This is my first ever podcast. Welcome to the Juggling Act. Today I'm interviewing Jack Monroe, food writer and anti-poverty campaigner. Jack's story is an interesting one. She had her son when she was in her early 20s. And her situation is actually pretty different to most of the women I've interviewed so far. The chief executives and MPs I've spoken to have had to tell me what it's like dealing with a busy, demanding job and juggling childcare and family life. But for Jack, the pressures were very different. Jack was in her early 20s when she had her child, and at that stage, her career hadn't yet taken off. For her, the juggle was about the hard economic reality of not having a job and worrying about whether she'd be able to pay the rent, the bills, and whether she could even afford food to feed her and her son. I can only imagine how difficult that must have been, and the thought of not being able to feed my baby fills me with absolute dread and panic. So you were in your early 20s when you had your son. Were you worried about how you were going to cope financially or with work once you went back?
Well, not really, because, perhaps naively, in my department there were lots of women who had children, and on paper, the fire service had loads of family-friendly, flexible policies, and I had a good job with a good salary, and I'd worked it all out on paper. I was like, so these are my 2 days, 2 nights, 4 days off. I'd found a local nursery down the road who were willing to take my son on. I'd sorted out this sort of military-style rota of where he was to be at every hour of every day that I was away at work, and who was due to pick him up from nursery and who was going to have him overnight on my night shift. So I was like, yeah, I've got this sorted. I've got this nailed. And I went back to work, and I didn't account for the fact that I was working 30 miles away from home. I didn't drive, so I was relying on public transport, and that the support structures I put in place would fail. Like, my trains would be late. The nursery would have a DMV outbreak and have to close for the afternoon, or somebody would forget it was their turn to do pickup, and I'd get a phone call saying, your son hasn't been picked up from nursery, and I'd be like, well, I'm 30 miles away.
That's really stressful.
Yeah, extraordinarily stressful. And so it only takes a couple of the cards to come out of that structure for the whole thing to come tumbling down, and it became increasingly stressful to micromanage from a distance, and a huge distance, in an emergency service where I had to be completely 110% focused on my job, and instead I was sitting there with my phone tucked under my thigh on my desk, checking all the time that the childcare arrangements had worked and that my son was safe and sound, and this inherent feeling of guilt started to gnaw away at me, that I'd had this baby and I was just shipping him around like a parcel. I started to feel like I was failing, and as all of those individual structures that I'd put in place to try to, support me going back to work started to crumble, so did I. And I ended up at the doctor just saying, oh doctor, I've got this permanent headache and I'm not really sleeping very well. And she listened to me talk for about 5 minutes and then immediately signed me off for a few weeks with stress, gave me beta blockers, sleeping pills, antidepressants, and went, you need to do something differently because this is not sustainable. And I was like, no, I love my job, I'll make it work. And ended up resigning about a month later from a hospital bed where I'd just completely collapsed with stress and exhaustion and anxiety and depression, and I tapped out my resignation on my mobile and was like, well, it's not sustainable. So
Yes.
off I go.
And what were you doing? You were working for the fire service as a call handler, is that right?
Yeah, I was in the control room.
What was your support network when you were doing the job? Did your parents help, for example, friends?
Yeah, my parents helped. I had 2 friends that helped, and my son's father helped. So I had people all mucking in and helping. But because it was a shift system, it was really difficult to sort of organise people to help out, because it would be, well, can you do Tuesday this week, but Wednesday next week, but Thursday the week after, and Friday the week
regular.
after. So people had to work their own work patterns and shifts around me, and I was just depending on so many different people to put me and my son first. Basically, it just got to a point where it wasn't sustainable anymore. And people over the last 10 years have said, well, didn't you think of that? And I'm like, I thought of everything. I had a ring binder that would go around with that son that had emergency contact details in, and a handover book, and everybody would write to each other in it, and they'd be like, Jonathan had a lovely time today, Jonathan ate this today, Jonathan had a bowel movement at 2 p.m. today. I would literally, the like a little A5 ring binder, and it would go to nursery, and it would go to my parents, and it would go to his dad, and it came with him. I still have it somewhere. And I wanted to make sure that I did the best that I could to do the best that I could for him. And when I first shot into the public eye, there was a real rhetoric that was sort of repeated in the comments sections of most newspapers that I just sort of waltzed out of my job for an easy life on benefits. And I'm like, you got no idea what I did to try to sustain the situation that I was in at the time. I loved my job.
When you quit your job, you were in the middle of a breakdown. It sounds like you were in hospital.
Yeah, I was very much in the middle of a breakdown. I was already broken down, and I sort of woke up in A&E with a psychiatrist sitting on the end of my bed. She introduced herself. She was like, hello, I'm a psychiatrist. And I was like, uh-oh, things have gone wrong.
Yes.
This isn't good news. And so I did my best to behave like a sane person, which, as you know, or you may not know, but as you might suspect in that situation, just makes you look madder.
Yeah.
And yeah, you end up in a no-win situation then. And I was like, no, I'm fine, and solely responsible for a minor, but that's also fine. And and we just went home and muddled along.
And then what happened? You signed on to benefits, did you, for a couple of years whilst looking for a job?
Yes, so I went down the job centre and I signed on, and the job centre told me that because I'd made myself intentionally unemployable, that I didn't qualify for benefits for a certain period of time.
No.
Because
you quit?
Because I'd quit my job. They never really clarified what intentionally unemployable meant, but I was like, by having a baby?
Yeah. And struggling to cope with the logistics.
I didn't get any benefits for about 2 months until I ended up writing to my MP in a sort of a fit of desperation, and then he intervened and got them sorted out for me. But by that point, I was already behind on my rent, I was already behind on my council tax, my water rates, my water bill, my gas, my electric. And this was back in the day before bank charges were capped. So my bank was putting £25 a day on every bounced direct debit. And then I was getting £12 a day late payment charges from every individual bill. So what starts off as a £6 water bill ends up as a £43 with charges. And that basically got me into a hole that has taken years to get out of.
Yeah,
absolutely years to dig myself out of. And I'm still not out of it, because I've still got county court judgments on my credit rating from that period. And every time I got like a down payment on a book deal or a decent contract, I would just start going through the piles of unopened post in my hallway and being like, what can I pay off now? Or what can I pay off now? And it's just been endless trying to catch it up. But I think I'm there.
Almost there.
I think I'm there. It's been quite a ride.
It sounds like it. And it sounds for that period of time, you were applying for jobs and trying to get work.
Yeah.
Did your parents or family help you?
They had no idea, actually, because I didn't say a word to them.
Oh dear.
And I regret that now, and because, I mean, they're not wealthy, my parents. My dad was a firefighter, my mum was a nurse. But when they finally found out that I was in so much trouble, they were both really upset that I hadn't come to them for help. But I guess I just kept burying my head and thinking, it can't possibly get any worse than this. It can't possibly get any worse than this. It's got to get better at some point. And thinking that, you know, the old rhetoric, if I just kept my head down and worked hard, it would all sort itself out. And I just carried on applying for jobs and thinking, maybe this is the one that I'll get. Maybe this is the one that I'll get. And I just got nowhere. And I look back now and I think that, you know, it was the bite point of the recession. Austerity had hit, the high street was in trouble, and employers were suddenly looking for 0-hour contract, flexible working. The language of job applications had changed from when I was a teenager, where they say, oh, we need you to work Saturdays 9 till 1 and Sundays 10 till 2. And they'd instead say Monday to Sunday 7 till 7, 16 hours in this period. And
I see.
I can't, I need fixed hours. I've got a child. And because there were so many people competing for the same bit part minimum wage jobs, why would they give it to the fuss pot that needed specific hours around nursery over the eager young teenager who
can
could
just
work
do anything?
So I started to keep my job applications in an email inbox, like a separate folder, and I stopped when it got to over 340 in the course of a year, and I hadn't got a single one of them, and then I stopped counting after that.
Yeah.
And I applied for everything. I applied to be a forklift truck driver because they said there was training on the job. I was like, I'm sure that's not too difficult, you know. Like, it's not a game to me. I needed a job. And, I just kept going, kept applying for the same things again and again and again.
It sounds like the juggle for you was the financial stress of being a mum, trying to juggle the bills, trying to make sure you had enough to eat. Do you think that's right?
Yes, very much so. It was a permanent juggling act, simultaneously trying to keep up with looking your best and looking like you weren't falling apart at the seams, because with my parents' extensive history of fostering, I had, still have, a slightly irrational fear of social services, because I'd grown up in a house where children would be delivered to the front door in the middle of the night with a bag of clothes, and there'd be no discernible reason to my child head as to why they were there.
Yeah.
So in my head, and because I've grown up with that scenario for decades,
it was very real for you that children could be taken away from their
children
parents.
can be taken away from their parents and can just be whisked away in the middle of the night and plonked at some stranger's door and not see their parents again for years. And the fear was very real. And when I stopped eating myself and I wasn't able to pay my bills and my flat was cold and then it was dark and I was unplugging the fridge and my son's trousers were slightly too small and his shoes were slightly too small and we weren't, I wasn't meeting pretty much any of my basic needs, and a lot of his were just about scraping the acceptable limit. I was genuinely hugely concerned that if anybody knew how anxious and depressed and literally mental I was, that they would deem that I was unfit to look after my son. So I would put my best coat on to go to the food bank.
Yes.
And in some cases I ran into a woman who went to church with my parents, and I told her I was picking a parcel up for a friend who couldn't make it.
I see, so the shame almost of struggling.
I just didn't want her to tell anyone that she'd seen me there, because there is a massive sense of shame, and you're trying to present your best self to the world because you want to be employed, you want to get a job, and you want to look like you're coping. But at the same time, I just wanted somebody to notice that things weren't all as they seemed.
But you needed some help.
Yeah, I just wanted somebody to really notice underneath the best coat and the carefully brushed hair, and that actually this was a young woman who was in trouble.
Yeah. And who did notice in the end? Did someone notice?
Yeah, it was a worker at the local children's centre. I went to a mum's group called Moto, Mothers on Their Own, on a Wednesday morning. It was a Shore Start Children's Centre, and it was quite a walk from my flat, but they did like a free lunch. And so it was from 11 till 1, and so from 11 till 12 it was this sort of enforced socialisation where you all had to sit around in a circle, and like all your kids would play together and stuff, and we'd all talk stiltedly about common issues, and as some sort of support network. But you had to do that bit for an hour before you got your lunch, so we'd all be sitting around being like, how was your week? Just sort of counting down the minutes to the lunch. And one of the women who worked there noticed that I would always go and help with the washing up, and I would be basically scraping leftovers into like Tupperwares, and she clocked me doing that a couple of times, and I would just be brightly like, oh, I can't abide waste, just take this home, feed it to the foxes. And after like a couple of times of doing that, she sort of stopped me in the kitchen, and I thought she was going to tell me off, or that I was going to be in trouble, or she was going to say some health and safety thing like, you can't take that off the premises and reheat it or something. And she was like, would you like a referral form for the local food bank? And I was like, no. And inside I was like, yes.
Yes, please.
I was like, no, don't need one. No. I just don't like waste. And the next week when I came back, she wouldn't take no for an answer. She was like, look, you've been coming here for a few months now. She was like, you look thin. You look exhausted. She was like, you eat seconds and thirds and then take the leftovers home. There is something wrong in your household, and I'm not taking no for an answer. Please take this form, and if you feel that it could help you,
use it.
Yeah, use it.
And you weren't eating at the time because there wasn't enough food. Is that what you meant when you said you weren't eating?
Yeah, there wasn't enough for me and my son. I always found it quite wryly amusing that the tagline that came with my early fame was the mum who fed herself and her son on £10 a week. And I don't know, the mum who half fed herself and fed her son on £10 a week, because it wasn't that there were not enough calories for an adult in that meal plan.
Yeah. And what was the situation with the father of your son? So you guys split up, I think, before your son was born. Is that right?
Yeah, we weren't together by the time he was born, but he always said that he would be supportive, and we'd been very good friends for a long time beforehand. And he was a good man. He's always been supportive. He lost his job just after I left mine.
Oh dear, bad timing.
Which was pretty atrocious timing, but he found another one fairly quickly. And he would have Johnny a few nights a week.
Great. And
so that I could sort of have some downtime, and also because we co-parent, and we always have. That was our situation. I never felt comfortable asking him for money because he did minimum wage jobs as well. Do you know, I valued the relationship that he would have with his son over, a couple of sort of measly checks here and there.
Yes.
And I've been criticised for that in the past, but actually 10 years down the line, we're still the best of friends. We still have a brilliant relationship, and so we all do. Yeah. And I think it wouldn't have made a difference at that time, an extra 13 quid a week or whatever it would have been.
Yeah.
But what makes a difference is Johnny having a very present, very active, very loving, very supportive father.
And what do you think the government or someone needs to do to help parents in these kind of situations?
I think that the move to increase the amount of Healthy Start vouchers is a very welcome one, but it's not enough. I think the universal credit uplift during lockdown was brilliant, but taking it away will plunge millions of people into poverty. And it's just an extra £20 a week, like when they've got literally billions for various other things, like an extra 20 quid a week to keep people out of the most desperate situations. It's a preventative measure. If you invest in early years health for children, you're going to save a fortune later down the line in repairing the damage that's been done. It's a bit of a pet subject of mine at the moment, because I've spent 10 years banging on about how we need to make provision for children and adults in poverty better, but it seems to fall largely on deaf ears. So I've been doing a lot of research lately into the long-term impact of deprivation and destitution into development, and there's so much research out there that shows that even living temporarily in poverty can have decades-long reaching impact into the mental health of children and young people and the physical health of children, young people and adults. It's to do with like the development of the hippocampi, it's to do with the development of a fight and flight response. Children who've lived in poverty are more likely to engage in risky behaviours as adults, whether that's drug taking or like petty crime. Children who are inadequately fed or nourished tend to develop like health problems later in life. You end up with a higher risk of cancer, of various other. There's just so much.
It gets worse and worse, doesn't it?
And you just think it's about investing now in just lifting people out of those situations with a few extra quid a week and making benefits paid in full and on time and adequate for a living standard, not just a surviving standard. And then the amount that will save further down the line in treatment and in NHS care and in rectifying the issues that will have been rooted in that period of time. Feeding children now and making sure that people are adequately and safely housed now will save money in the long term.
Yeah.
It's a sort of like, if we've got to be mercenary about it, if you can't do it just because it's the right thing to do it because years down the line you'll make a return on your investment.
Yeah, it makes financial sense as well.
Yeah, makes economical sense as well as human sense.
Yes. Did you worry about your ability to cope with having a baby, with being a single mum, say with being up all night in the feeds and then running around trying to get baby grows? Was that a concern for you?
I mean, I just sort of did it. And I'm not even entirely sure now how. I look at him now and he's nearly 11 and he's strong and he's resilient and he's confident and he's hilarious, and I'm like, and there were days when I would just sit on the floor holding you, crying because I didn't know what I was doing.
Yeah. Well, you were very young, actually, when you had him.
And I would just be sitting there holding the baby that was crying, that had been fed and was clean and was being cuddled, skin-to-skin contact, and was full and was warm and was safe but was still crying.
Yes.
And I would just be crying as well, because I'd be
Yeah.
like, I don't know what I'm doing.
Yeah.
And my mum was brilliant, but I didn't always ring her because I didn't want to be always being like, I don't know what I'm doing. I tried to tough it out rather a lot more than I probably should have done. Yeah, I just look back now and I think I struggled to breastfeed.
It is jolly hard.
I just couldn't. I couldn't do it. And I also think there's quite a lot of pressure on mothers to get it all right and to do everything, and to co-sleep or not to co-sleep, to breastfeed or not to breastfeed, to do skin contact and kangaroo care, and to do all of these things. And actually, I found instinct was a very valuable driver in those times.
Yeah.
It was kind of are you safe? Are you warm? Are you fed? Are you clean? Good.
Yes. But then they don't shush.
No, I know. If only. But do you know what? You learn to live in that sort of chaotic noise, don't you?
In what way does being gay affect your parenting? Or your experience of parenting, I guess?
For a while, there was a bit of a sticky period where my son could not understand why Daddy couldn't marry me and we couldn't all live together. And then Daddy married someone else. And I was right, so that solves that one then. Brilliant. And we all get along and it's all brilliant. But for quite a while it was like, well, why can't Daddy live with us? Why can't you and Daddy get married? And I was like, because Mummy doesn't love men in the same way that she loves women. Like, Mummy's gay. And do you know what gay means?
Yeah.
Yes. Okay, I had to reinforce that a few times. But he's totally cool with it. He's never seemed embarrassed by it. There was an incident when, at one of his previous schools, when I'd done an interview with, I think, Grazia, about being non-binary, and a kid much bigger than him came up to him in the playground and said, "Your mum's a tranny." And Johnny didn't know what that word meant. He was only about 5. But I suspect he gathered from the tone being used that it was an insult, and he smacked the kid and got suspended.
Oh dear.
And I was like, well, where are your policies about sort of bullying? Because because Johnny refused to tell me for ages what it was that the boy had said that made him lash out. And he's not a violent kid in the slightest.
Yes.
He was, wouldn't say boo to a cushion. But he obviously just got really riled up by this boy taunting him. And I said to the school, I said, well, what's your policy on, what this child said? Have you spoken to his parents?
Yeah.
Because that's language that he's obviously picked up at home. No primary school child should be using terms. Well, nobody should be using terms like that.
Yeah.
But primary school children especially, it's shocking. And they were really, blasé about it. And one of the teaching staff said something along the lines of, well, if you will go plastering your private business all over magazines or something. And I was like, oh, okay, cool, right, okay, yes, so we're at fault here, okay, cool. And then he wasn't at that school for much longer.
No.
So, but apart from that, there's been no issue. It's just
great.
It just is, isn't it?
Yes. Well, that's how it should be, really.
Yeah.
I was wondering about with not necessarily how you thought it had affected your parenting, but maybe how the world might have responded to you.
I did get a lot of abuse about being gay online for quite a long time. And I never really understood what the problem with that was. Any of anybody else's business, really.
No, absolutely.
It's just who I am, and genuinely couldn't really see what the whole ire of it was. I think some people felt like I'd deceived my son's father into having a baby with me. I'm like, he'd known me for years. He knew who and what I was. Believe me, we'd been friends for quite some time. Some people felt that I, wasn't a real lesbian because I'd had a baby, and because apparently you have to hand your womb in, or, getting your gay card. And I think for some people it's just another thing that they can pick on. But I'm extraordinarily secure in my sexuality and in my identity, and I just think if someone's got an issue with that, times gone past that would have hurt me, and I would have attempted to mask it or hide it or not talk about it. And now I'm just like, look, I didn't come this far to only come this far. I'm not gonna subdue myself for the sake of some anonymous ranting prick on the internet. I'm just gonna be myself, and if they don't particularly like it, well, I'm not particularly bothered, actually.
Yes. Maybe it's none of their business.
Gaying
either.
about.
That's a good way of describing it. Obviously now you're this amazingly successful food writer. How did that all happen?
That was an accident. It was before, or was it before as well? I do keep meaning to do like a timeline of events because really I spent 2010 to 2014 just in survival mode.
Yeah.
And so I'm aware of things that happened, but I'm not quite au fait with the order in which they happened or how exactly they happened sometimes, because I was just concentrating on, not getting in any more trouble. But basically one of my friends, David, was a local journalist, and he said to me that there had been a talk to the press email had come round. I didn't even know what one of those was. Then they were looking for a mum who was going to have a really rubbish Christmas, and that sounded like me.
Oh.
Thanks, David. Cheers for that. And he wanted to know if he could pass my details on to the journalist to possibly interview me. And again, I was like, I don't really want to be in the paper, thank you.
So were you working as a journalist at this stage?
No, this was before.
Oh, right.
But what happened next took quite a while to come about. And Dave went back and spoke to the journalist, who came back to me and said, they'll pay you £250. Now, this was the week or two before Christmas, and I didn't have any presents. I was behind on my gas bill, so the house was cold. I didn't have any decorations up or anything. I thought, my son is going to have a rubbish Christmas, and so am I. All right, I'll do the interview. Who's it with? I said, it's the Sunday People. So they came round and they did an interview, and it's double-page spread. This mum has just £10 for food. Picture of me looking very thin with my son asleep on my shoulder in my flat, which looks really spacious and classy, but it's actually because it didn't have any furniture in it.
Yeah.
So it looks like this huge apartment, but actually it was a regular sized apartment. It just didn't have anything in it. And as part of the interview, the journalist said, what do you buy with that £10 for food? And I reeled off a list. I was like, kidney beans are 17p a can. They were back then. Can of tomatoes, can of baked beans, some tinned mackerel, some frozen veg, some, a stew pack of a couple of carrots, onion, a swede, some potatoes, etc. And she just sort of looked at this receipt that I'd produced. I still got it. And she was like, what do you make out of that? And I was like, so with the kidney beans, I use half of them with that carrot and the onion in a chilli with some of the tomatoes and some of those spices there. And then the other half of the can, I make a carrot, cumin and kidney bean burger. So that's the carrots, and so that's a carrot, an onion, a little bit of cumin, half a can of kidney beans. And then with this, and I put them all together and made a rough sort of meal plan out of what I'd made the week before. And they put it in the side of the article as a little sidebar. They were like, and this is what she survives on. And I think it was supposed to be a sort of a kind of look at this shocking state of affairs, like this paltry kidney bean burger type thing. And a few months later, Xanthi at the Telegraph got in touch and said, I've been following your story and your blog with interest, and I first read about it in the Sunday People in that little sidebar of ingredients. Do you mind if I come round for lunch? I was like, why in God's name would you want to come round for lunch for somebody who's living off smart price baked beans and tomatoes thrown together into whatever sort of hellish mess they can make out of it? But I was like, I had nothing to lose really, and by this point I'd already been in the paper, and I was a bit like, that's nice. And also, I thought Xanthi sounded like a really exotic, posh person.
Yeah.
And I was like, this would be nice. And also, when you're really poor, nobody comes round your house anymore because it's cold and you haven't got any biscuits, and, all you do is whinge about how poor you are. And I'm making light of that, but it is actually quite an isolating experience.
Yes, I bet.
And so I kind of was a bit like, I've got nothing to lose. So I said yes. She came round for lunch and she wrote it up as this lovely article called My 49p Lunch with a girl called Jack. And Penguin had been watching me and watching my blog apparently since the first Sunday People article. And when Xanthi's article came out, they got in touch to offer me a recipe book deal.
Oh, how exciting.
And at that time, I wasn't working for the Echo, or maybe I'd only just started. But I was still very much in survival, need a job mode. And as much as my head was saying, I can't do this, I can't write a book, like I literally cannot write a book, didn't have a computer at that point because I'd sold it to pay the rent. And I was like, me write a book? I was like, well, what they're offering me is a sum of money to do a year of work, and that's a job.
Yeah.
So if I just divide that by 12 and
It's like having a salary.
It's like having a salary, of course. Now I know it's nothing like having a salary. being a writer, it's more like sort of being a busker. A mildly unsuccessful one at that. But I said yes, and I wrote that book on my phone because I didn't have a computer.
Did you?
And yeah, a little Nokia E72, which again I still have because I keep a little box of these things from this time that anytime now I start to feel a bit piteous about my life or work situation or a bit whingy, I go and look at it and I'm like, that's what you used to eat, that's what you used to work on, like buckle up and go and sit back down at your Mac and get on with your job. But yeah, and I wrote that book and I thought it would be a flash in the pan, sort of one hit wonder kind of thing. I was like, it's nice, I'll write a book and then I'll go back and do whatever job I'm doing after that.
Yeah.
And I genuinely didn't think that I'd still be here a decade later writing my 8th.
You've had loads of books, haven't you?
Yeah, quite a few.
Hearing Jack talk about losing her job and struggling for money was really eye-opening. There have been so many articles or news stories about poverty in the UK, but hearing her story about what it's like to actually not have enough money to buy basic things is incredibly troubling. Jack described how she was judged for leaving her job, but actually she was in the middle of a breakdown when she left the fire service. She didn't really have a choice. And then when she was well enough, she busted a gut looking for a job again. She was trying her very best. But it was tough out there for a single mum. When she described the flexible 0-hour contracts for working parents, they're pretty unhelpful. If you've got to work 10 days over 14, but no one's going to tell you when those days are until the last minute, how on earth are you supposed to organise childcare? There is so much money in society generally. It makes me think that more needs to be done to help families like Jack who are really struggling. Perhaps as a society, we should be embarrassed that for some families there isn't enough money to even buy food for their children. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please do consider supporting our journalism by taking out a Telegraph subscription. You can get your first 30 days for free at telegraph.co.uk/audio.